Hey, good morning. My name is Bob Chandler, and as a member of the Roanoke or the RVA's Education Committee, I want to thank you all for attending our class on environmental hazards. We have a few things to kind of go over here real quick, and then I'll introduce the speakers. So this is a hybrid class. We probably have 10, 15 here and all you out in Zoom land. So thank you for being here. Those of you out there in Zoom land, please make sure that you mute your computer, so we're not hearing your dogs barking or the kids screaming or all those things that happens in the Zoom class. If you do have a question, you can unmute at that time. In here, we've already talked about it. Make sure that you realize how sensitive our microphones are in the classroom. Although we will hear everything you don't want us to hear, but they will not hear the questions you ask. So we will tend to repeat the questions so everyone out there can catch them. Let's see, where are we? After each presentation, we'll have some question and answer time. You can also, if you have any questions, we have Laura Benjamin here. She's sitting in her office and she's monitoring all this, and any questions that come in through the chat, she will get to us so that she can ask them for you. So if you don't want to ask the question, but you want an answer, just pass it on to her and she'll be happy to take care of that for you. We do have two presenters today. And let's see, the first one is Alexandra Moon. She's with ECS. Alexandra serves as a senior environmental project manager in the Roanoke office and has been with ECS for almost 16 years. Her responsibilities include asbestos surveys, lead-based paint screenings, random samplings, microbial assessments, as well as phase 1 environmental site assessments and noise assessments. Our second presenter will be John Stump with Hill Top Contractors. He is a project manager and co-owner of Hill Top Contractors along with his brother, and it was founded in 2007. John is a Class A environmental contractor specializing in petroleum remediation. He has personally removed 400 to 500 below and above ground petroleum storage tanks, ranging in size from the small residential 275-gallon tanks to the commercial 10,000-gallon capacity tanks. Today's presentations were created by each presenter and reflect their views, opinions, and experience, and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or recommendations of RVAR. We are recording today's class, and it will be available for a 30-day period. At the end, we're going to be sending each of you a survey. We ask that you fill this out and get it back to us. Not only do we want input on today's class, but we'd like some ideas on future classes. And please do send it back. Laura has told me that if we do not get them back, I will be coming to your house for them. The best time I have available is Sunday morning between 5 and 6 a.m. So either get them back or make me breakfast. So all that being said, and Ms. Moon, thank you very much.
Hello. Just getting my presentation sharing. Is that? So today I'm going to talk to you guys about asbestos, lead-based paint, and mold. Our asbestos awareness class, just so you guys are all aware, is about 2 hours long. I'm not going to keep you here that long. We're just going to briefly touch on these three topics. Of course, like I said, we could go on for forever about these. So what is asbestos? Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral. It forms during around the same time as talc is formed. It can form at the same time as vermiculite, and both of these items oftentimes have asbestos as contaminants. I know it's not necessarily real estate related, but you probably have heard of both of these in the news regarding vermiculite contaminant and talc contaminants. One of the good things about asbestos is that it's very strong. It's a rock, but it's also soft and fibrous and can be woven. It's used as fire resistance, chemical resistance, and it's a great insulator. Oftentimes it would be found or used in cloths such as tablecloths or curtains in fire, for fireproofing on stages. When they used to use lit candles as lighting on stages, they would oftentimes use asbestos cloths for their fire curtains, or oh my goodness, for their curtains. I apologize. Is also used as chemical resistance. There's two different types of asbestos. There's many types of asbestos. There's two different families. One of the families is chrysotile in the serpentine family. That's the most often that you'll see if you ever get to see asbestos results. And then you have your amphiboles, which house all of your other asbestos. So you have your chrysotolite, your tremolite. Here's an example just to give you an idea. On top of a penny, under a microscope, you can see 2 to 3 grains of rice. You also see 5 to 6 human hairs. And then in that tiny little circle there is about 20,000 asbestos fibers. So asbestos can be very small, obviously, when it's used. And it's used throughout different building products. And I say that it's used throughout many different building products, including fireproofing, plasters, flooring, and you guys can, I'm sure, read roofing, siding, acoustical panels, terrazzo flooring. Here's some examples of asbestos that you might see inside of buildings. This is poor condition asbestos pipe insulation. Here's an example of asbestos containing materials on a boiler, as well as 9x9 floor tile with black mastic. Just recently, and as the introduction said, I've been doing this for about 16 years. Just recently, I found for the first time this, let's see, these 12x12 ceiling tiles or 1x1 ceiling tile to come back also containing asbestos, not just the mastic. Typically, it's mostly the mastics that you'll find, but just recently, this material here, the 1x1s, I identified actually as containing asbestos. This is an example of a roofing material. It's the tar and the silver paint. Inside of these light fixtures behind the light bulbs will also include asbestos fireproofing. Basically, it's the newer ones contain fiberglass, but your older ones can contain that fiberglass is actually replaced with asbestos. And this is an example of asbestos in natural position. We are located in an area that has naturally occurring asbestos, especially if you work in Lynchburg. The Sam's Club, when they installed the new fueling station at the Sam's Club there, we actually were on site doing air monitoring while they were digging the dirt so that we could make sure that the natural occurring asbestos wasn't actually getting out into the air. So what does asbestos mean to you guys as real estate agents? One thing to keep in mind is that while asbestos is used in a lot of building materials, you'll find it, like I said, in insulation, in floorings, in walls. Plaster and joint compound both contain asbestos. It's not as common, it's not as frequent, but it does happen. One thing to know is that asbestos is not dangerous unless it is disturbed. So we're looking, if we're talking a demolition or a renovation, or if it's in poor condition, that's when asbestos becomes dangerous. So if you have your clients talking to you and they are concerned, I'm afraid that this material or my house may contain asbestos, the first thing to say is the only way to know is by testing, but then also to alleviate their fears and let them know that unless you plan on, I know most people do, renovations or then it's not a huge concern. If you have good condition 9x9 floor tile in your home and you don't intend on doing anything with it, then it's not an issue. You can easily cover it with carpet or whatever, and it's not necessarily a health issue. One thing to know, and I know this isn't really relating to the presentation, and I apologize, But one thing to note is that for federal regulations, for any type of renovation or demolition, asbestos survey is required. The Virginia Building Code states 1985. And so if you ever go to get a permit, you'll most likely, most localities, Roanoke, Salem, they both require an inspection only if it's a structure built pre-1985. However, that number is actually not relevant. It's just a number that somebody pulled and put into the Virginia Code. So to give you a background on the use and bans of regulations regarding asbestos. So asbestos has been around for a very long time. It's been in use since the Egyptians. It was used by the Romans, like I said, as tablecloths. They would actually take these 100% asbestos tablecloths, basically throw them in a fire, and that's how they cleaned them because it's fireproof. But around in the 1970s, the manufacturing and application of spray applied fireproofing and insulation was banned. In 1975, they added on to that, including wet applied asbestos, such as joint compound or molded and block, which is the preformed asbestos that you'll find that you would wrap around pipes versus the wrapped kind. In 1976, they then added another ban of mechanical system insulation. 77, they added artificial fire embers and wall patching compound. And then in 78, they expanded the 73 ban to include decorative applications. By 1989, all asbestos was phased out. It's supposed to be phased out in 3 stages by 1997. However, the asbestos industry, like everything, fought, and that got overturned in 1991 before the ban went into place. So by 1994, the EPA, so in 91, the 97 ban got overturned, if that makes sense. And the 89 ban that was supposed to be done by 97 was overturned. Right now, what we're sitting at for the official ban is going to be what was published in 94, which only includes new uses of asbestos, flooring, specialty papers, friable pipe insulation and sprayed applied surfacing, which is going to be like fireproofing, and then artificial embers and wall patching compound. Those are the only materials that are actually banned. So you could potentially have a floor tile that you used to create, and then you manufacture, it contains asbestos, it still does. There is no ban in the United States to not use asbestos. And that's one of the reasons why the federal government requires an asbestos survey to be completed at any time for demolition or renovations. When it comes to wall patching compound, investigators or like investigative reporters, a couple of them, have actually done research and taken joint compound from the shelf at Lowe's, Home Depot, and collected samples of this material, sent it into the lab for analysis, and have found up to 2% asbestos in these materials still to this day, even though they are banned. And the way that this is happening is because it's partly a contamination issue, because as I stated earlier, asbestos forms naturally along with talc and gypsum. So it's partly a contamination issue. It is also partly the fact that the materials are not being made in the United States, they're being shipped in. And of course, throughout the world, there's asbestos still used in most of these applications. So be careful if you're talking to people regarding their homes. Even newer homes can contain asbestos. So what do we do when we're inspecting for asbestos? So the first step is we review any files that we might have. Are there architectural plans that are available where we can see that they asked to use, like it specifically will state on there asbestos fireproofing used or asbestos floor tile. We will review any plans that we might have where we've done an inspection previously. We identify the materials that we want to take a look at, and that requires a walk through the building. We would identify stuff as floor tiles, cove base, walls, ceiling tiles. We collect the samples, we bag, we tag, we throw them on a chain of custody and submit to a lab for analysis, and then we submit the report. So once you've identified if asbestos containing, or if there's asbestos material present, you, depending on what's going on, what your plans are for the project, you may or may not need to have it professionally abated. If the material is just there, it can stay in place. It can be covered by other materials. It can be enclosed by another wall or covered by carpet. However, if you are going to impact the material, it has to be removed by a licensed abatement contractor. We oftentimes recommend asbestos project designs or specifications to be completed. This helps as a protection to both the owner and the abatement contractor so that a clear scope of work has been established. This is a guy wearing his PPE, his personal protective equipment, getting ready to go inside of an abatement project. The pump he's wearing is a personal pump, basically was determining how much asbestos they may be exposed to while doing their job. As I indicated, asbestos is required to be removed by a DPOR licensed asbestos contractor. The EPA no longer requires a 10-day notification unless you're working in the state, unless you're working in DC. However, there is still a 20-day calendar notice for the Department of Labor here in Virginia. Again, depending on what type of material is being removed and how much is being removed, a third-party monitor may be required. It's one of those, that's something that you would want to discuss with your asbestos professional on if it's necessary, if it's required, if it's recommended. The abatement contractor officially should not, it's considered a conflict of interest, hire the third-party monitor, but that oftentimes is the case as long as the owner of the property is aware and approves. So the pricing varies. It depends on the material that's being removed, how much is being removed, and the time of year. And of course, like everything going on right now in our society, the pricing is changing drastically, constantly, all the time. And nothing is really consistent right now. But the time of year is definitely a stickler when it comes to abatement. Most asbestos abatement contractors are very busy in the summer because that's when schools are out and a lot of school work is done. So I ran through asbestos really quickly. Are there any questions, or do we want to save them all till the end? Because then we got lead and mold still. Okay, so lead-based paint. So lead-based paint is another environmental hazard that, of course, is for the most part not a huge issue anymore regarding newer structures. So in 1978, lead-based paint was banned and actually is really banned. It's not one of these silly things that asbestos, like where it may or may not be used anymore. So in residential settings, a house that is constructed post 1978 likely does not contain lead. Of course, when you start getting close to that age, that border, you got to be careful simply because contractors may have had lead-based paint left over that they're using on these last couple of structures kind of deals. So we oftentimes recommend even into the early 1980s to still have a lead survey done if there's a concern, or if there's lead level issues or something. So there are a couple of regulations when it comes to lead-based paint. Of course, you have OSHA. OSHA is involved everywhere. So that is lead in construction. And that's going to pretty much cover anybody who's doing construction. Because one thing to note, I should have mentioned just a second ago, is that lead-based paint has not been banned in commercial use. It's very difficult to find, but it is still available in to the military industries and things like that. Lead-based paint does exist. It's just not allowed to be used on residential. So then the US EPA has come out with the RRP rule. This has been around for probably at least 10 plus years now. What this is it is required that any contractor who is doing work on a residential structure or a child occupied facility be RRP certified if the house is constructed prior to 1978. When this originally rolled out, they allowed the homeowner to waive the requirement of having an RRP certified contractor to do the renovation if they could prove that the house would not be occupied by a child. So if it was an older couple who had no children and they were never going to have kids in their house, they could waive the right for an RRP certified contractor. However, this has, they have removed that exception. We are actually even required to have HUD level screenings and surveys done, as well as RRP certified contractor when we were doing work on a 55 and up residential facility. It was even though it's 55 and up and it's set in the bylaws that no children could stay there, we still had to do RRP certified and lead work like there would be kids. And then of course, HUD funded projects or other regulated housing facilities, of course, have to have lead testing done. So in the state of Virginia, to do any type of lead testing on a residential structure or a HUD property or a child occupied facility, you have to be licensed by the DPOR. Unless you are an RRP certified contractor and are doing a clearance at the end of your project, then that does not have to be done by a DPOR licensed inspector. There are two types of sampling that's done: is paint chip sampling, and then your XRF, which is with a, nope, does it have, there it is. There's a picture of a handheld XRF for you. This is a very old version. I don't even know if this one is maintained anymore. They've gotten a little bit smaller, less clunky, so that's good. So OSHA does not actually accept XRF results. They require paint chip sampling or personnel monitoring to be done while work is being completed. One thing when it comes to residential HUD lead testing is that if you have a commercial structure that you, like a warehouse that's going to be converted into residential, then HUD requires that to be tested for lead, even if it's going to be a complete gut. We actually ran into a project that way. We did not know that was the intended use of the client until HUD stepped in and said, "Where's your lead?" And so we had to scramble and get that buttoned up for them. So when it comes to federal standards, HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development, I'm sure you guys all know that, is greater than 1 milligram per centimeter squared, or 0.5% by weight when it comes. So the greater than 1 milligram per centimeter squared is if you are looking at XRF results, and the 0.5% by weight is for paint chip samples. As I indicated, OSHA wants to actually see airborne sampling, so either personnel or perimeter sampling completed to see what the exposure would be based on the airborne. And then you'll see, as you can see, the action level, they don't really correlate to the HUD levels. They're a little bit different kind of monster we're looking at. One thing that OSHA also states is that any lead identified in paint is a concern for them. Which is why they don't really accept the XRF, because that gives you a negative positive and it can confuse the situation. So if it's greater than 1 milligram per centimeter squared, then it's considered lead-based paint. Any lead at all identified is considered lead-containing paint. I think we've discussed this already, that the federal law requires contractors to be RRP certified pre-1978 if they're doing any construction on a pre-1978 structure. This would include anybody who is just doing remodeling or impacting any type of lead. So if you're having windows replaced, they should be an RRP certified contractor. If you're having painting done and they have to prep surfaces prior to painting being completed, they should be an RRP certified contractor. This is a certification through the EPA. And I want to say it's a 5-year, every 5 years you have to have it redone. You have to go through the training again. And individual people as well as the company would have to have the RRP certification. It all comes down to protection. So lead-based paint is an inhalation and ingestion concern. let's see, yeah. So it's an inhalation and an ingestion concern when it comes to young children. The concern is crawling, touching surfaces, chewing on windowsills. It happens, and putting that into their mouths. And then the lead is a heavy metal. It attaches to your blood, and it impacts memories and learning. And that's one of the reasons why it's the biggest concern with children. Ingestion, paint chips, sources. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So chipping paint, deteriorating or chalking paint, or impacts by renovation or demolition. Friction surfaces, that's where your windows open, close, your doors open, close. Where they rub, that is considered a friction surface, and they can create dust. And if that paint contains lead, it can also, that dust then contains lead. So here is a picture of lead abatement occurring. And there has to be, I want to make it clear that there's a difference between abatement versus repair. So abatement is where you are permanently, purposefully removing the lead hazard. That would be if you have, you have lead on your windowsills and you are removing the windowsills simply because you want to remove the lead. That becomes abatement, and it has to be completed by a licensed DPOR lead abatement company or contractor. Repair, you are having your windows replaced and your windowsill is rotten, and so your window guy puts a new windowsill there. That is considered a repair, and it does not have to be done by a DPOR licensed person, but it should be done by a RRP certified contractor. So this goes into a little bit more details regarding the RRP rule. It applies to housing and child occupied facilities. So a child occupied facility has a very specific definition. Let's see, does it tell us? Let's see if I can remember all the details. You have to be, it is a facility that has children 6 and under who visit for more than 2 hours, 3 days a week, or 6 hours once a week. And there's another part to it. But it's a very specific definition. So a kindergarten or an elementary school that starts at 1st grade and doesn't allow anybody younger than 6 to join 1st grade doesn't actually consider a child occupied facility. But as soon as they add kindergarten or preschool in, it's now a child occupied facility. Of course, daycare, same thing. So it's required an EPA certification for both the company and the workers. And the biggest purpose of the RRP certified contractor is that it teaches lead safe practices. The lead safe practices include using dust collection, HEPA filtered sanders or other pieces of equipment, putting down poly, and then a cleaning verification at the end to make sure that the lead, that there is no lead dust present. So lead-based paint activities, anytime that lead painted components are impacted, then OSHA expects contractors to be monitored. When it comes to demolition, lead awareness training is necessary. And then of course, the still same lead safe practices, including containing dust, minimizing dust, and then careful cleanup. As a licensed contractor for RRP certified or as a DPOR licensed contractor, there are medical monitoring requirements. When it comes to demolition, a lead inspection is not always required. We can also do what's called a T-clip sampling. This is where we collect samples of the building stream to see if the materials are considered lead containing and potentially could leach lead into the groundwater. Mold. This is a fun one. Mold, these are pictures of some really bad houses. You get mold this bad, it's pretty obvious. For the EPA, mold is classified as an allergen. It is not necessarily something that impacts each person the same. It's going to be it's just like right now my allergies are killing me because birch pollen is one of the high ones, and I'm allergic to birch. In a couple of weeks, when ragweed hits its peak, I'm going to be even worse. And mold's the same way. Each person reacts to it differently. We have a couple of people who work for our company who we try to avoid sending to some of the worst mold programs or houses because they react very badly. Oftentimes you'll hear the terms and people will talk about black mold. So pretty much all mold, when it starts growing in a thick enough colony, will be black to the visible eye. Under the microscope, that's when you start getting colors. The quote unquote black mold that they're talking about is called Stachybotrys. It takes a material being saturated for a minimum of 28 days before it even starts to grow. So unless you have a significant water intrusion issue, you're not going to necessarily have black mold within, structures. So if you get a call from somebody freaking out that I've seen black mold, the first question is, well, how wet is it and how long has it been wet? So mold needs two things to grow. It needs a food source and it needs water. The food source can be something as simple as the paper on drywall. I've actually seen mold growing. I actually probably have seen it on commercials where they show a petri dish and someone puts their hand on it and there's mold growing. That's actually from the oils on your hands. So oftentimes we can see mold around light switches because that's where, constantly people are touching. And so that's the food source. It's going to be the oils on your hands, and that's going to be more of a superficial mold. And then the moisture oftentimes is from the air. Obviously, you also have your typical moisture intrusions, roof leaks. The house isn't graded properly away from the basements. You have water issues in entering basements. But a lot of times when you see superficial mold, at least, you're looking at a moisture issue such as humidity problems. So mildews, molds, mushrooms, rusts, smuts, and yeast, those are all examples of what we consider microbial or mold things that we look at when we're doing molds. And the big, like I said, you have to have the right conditions. So we're looking at humidity and a food source. One thing to also keep in mind is that as mold is growing, it's not as when it starts to die, when mold starts to die, it's going to release its spores because it's going to try to survive and keep itself. So when you start drying back, that's when you start going to get more of your spores being released and your respiratory issues. Mold is everywhere. Even if we go out and do mold abatement and remediation, we will still come back and find mold within your structure. The question is how much is there, and is it a significant amount? Moisture is the biggest thing that indicates that you're going to have a mold growth. So some molds can start growing within 24 hours, but as I stated, the Stachybotrys, the dangerous, scary black mold, it takes at least 24 days, 24 to 28 days to even start growing. So the recommendation for relative humidity is 20 to 65% humidity. So 20% is your store's target. Usually sits at about 20%, which is why as soon as you walk in, you're like, oh my gosh, I need some water. Where you're 65%, you're going to start getting really humid. You're going to be able to feel that it's very wet. I should have brought my moisture meter to tell you what the humidity is in here. So while the range is 20 to 65, 20%, you're going to be uncomfortable. 65%, you're going to be uncomfortable. You actually going to want to aim for the 30 to 50%. 65% is actually when you will start getting mold growth. So it's the highest end of the spectrum for sure. All right, let's see, we got wood, drywall, carpets, the glues under carpets, the glues behind vinyl wallpaper. If you don't see vinyl wallpaper very often in here, in use very often, at least I don't run into it. It is notorious for hiding mold. As you can see again in these pictures, the mold is very obvious, it's growing. clearly on the drywall. You can see where the studs are because it's not growing on the wood. But behind vinyl wallpaper, you will look and see, you'll walk into a facility and it looks gorgeous. And then you peel back the wallpaper and you can actually find mold growing on that glue. Oftentimes, poor ventilation is a key to mold growth. So a house is sitting for a long time, it doesn't have its HVAC system running, or it's running on a very minimal schedule, it oftentimes will start getting musty, and that mustiness is mold growing somewhere. It could be inside the walls, it could be under the carpet. So this is the picture that you see there is actually a house we went into. It had sat for, I want to say like 6 months, including several months over the summer. The humidity levels went through the roof. And you can see that the mold is growing on the surfaces of the cabinets. The good thing with this particular type of mold growth is that other than the tediousness of it, it just simply takes cleaning. Wiping it down with my antimicrobial surfaces and then getting your HVAC system running properly to make sure that you're keeping your humidity levels where they need to be. So when we go out and do a mold assessment, it includes surface observations. As you see, we walk in, we're like, whoo, you got some mold growing. But it also can include invasive observations. We don't see mold growing, but we still have problems. We might punch a hole in the wall, a small one, put a camera in, see if there's anything growing on the backside of the drywall. We have several pieces of equipment we use, a moisture meter. We'll use that to determine, is there water in the walls? We might see a water staining on a wall somewhere. We can take the moisture meter and see, is it still wet? If it's still wet, that would then trigger to do some type of building envelope specialist and bring in a building envelope specialist to see if we can figure out why you have moisture. Then earlier we saw a picture, this colorful one here. This is actually a thermal camera that we can use. And then you can see where the water stain is very obvious. But standing here, you might not actually see it based on the coloring or whatever. And so we can pick that up using the thermal system or the thermal camera. And then the last thing is sample collection. This is actually lower on our scale of things that we want to do. And like I said, sample collection, when you do air testing, it doesn't always pick something up, because if the moisture is still there and the spores are still growing, or the mold is still growing, it might not be sporulating. And if it's not sporulating, we're not going to pick anything up on the air samples. So it's mostly a visual, and then moisture survey, and then sample collection as a confirmation. Let's see. So these are both examples. We got a tape lift sample or surface sampling being done, a spore trap sampling being done. Let's go. Okay, so one thing I'm going to show you this with, these are quick results that we had from one site we did. When you do a mold survey, you want to have one outside starting your sampling event and then one on the end of your sampling event. The EPA does not have any type of requirements or levels that they consider safe. What they want to see is, and what we look for is that your samples inside are the same as or less than the concentrations and type of spores within your, based on your outside samples. And so this is why we do, we'll do both at the beginning and the end. As you can see in this example, we did 2 outside samples. And then all of a sudden we have this huge spike of Penicillium aspergillus, which is one of your most common indoor spores when you have a moisture intrusion issue. And you'll see we've got a spike of 100,000 samples, and we're like, oh my gosh, compared to 150 we had outside originally. Luckily, we did an exterior sample afterwards, and you can see that actually outside we had a spike of 140,000 spores. So something happened between our first sample and our third sample. It could have been a rainstorm came in. It could have been somebody was blowing leaves and it went near the air intake and pumped itself right into the facility. I'm not exactly sure what it was. I don't remember. But you can see that that's why we try to flank our samples. So mold remediation, the state of Virginia does not have any mold remediation licensing anymore. They did for 1 year. The first step, however, before mold remediation occurs is to stop your source of water. If it's humidity or if it's a roof leak, you need to fix that before you repair it. If you don't, or remediate, if you don't fix the repair, the source, you're more likely to have a recurrence. So remediation would include removal, cleaning, drying. It's recommended that you at least use a certified contractor. There's a lot of really good contractors in our area. We typically mainly work with ServPro, Service Masters, Blue Sky. There's a lot of other smaller companies too that will do a really good job as well. But looking for that certification is helpful.
What kind of certification, like what's the name of the certification we should be looking for? Like what letters will they have after their?
Usually it's like not AIHA. I can see it. I can picture the emblem. I can send you a picture of the emblem.
Okay.
It's the Association of Indoor Air Quality Certified, or like it's 6 letters.
Okay.
It's like AIHA or AHIA. I'm sorry, I don't remember. Mold is everywhere. The goal is to maintain your moisture and temperatures. Like I said, you should probably maintain around 30 to 60% relative humidity. In the winter, 68 to 74 degrees is reasonable. Much higher than that, you're going to start getting mold growth, even with the lower relative humidity. And then same with summer. 80 is a little high. You're again going to potentially start with mold growth when you get that close. It's probably more of a 72 to 78 range is probably what you want to aim for. Post remediation, you want to look at, it's going to be the same thing like an initial assessment. We're going to look at we're going to do a visual. We're going to look at, make sure that the materials that were removed prior to build back, we want to take a look and make sure that they're leaving the surfaces dry and clean that's left, and have been treated properly. And then of course, potentially do air testing at the end, if so need it. So I feel like I ran through that, but at the same time, I might have gone really long, and I apologize. Are there any questions?
We got a couple. We'll start with Laura.
Okay.
Laura, did you have a question?
Yes, we've got one question from the Zoom crowd. Can realtors buy a moisture meter to do an unofficial inspection?
Yes. Yeah. So I, for the longest time, used a General brand, like that's the brand name is General. You can get them at, what's that? Yeah, you can get them at Home Depot and Lowe's, but you can also get, not Tractor Supply. What's the one that's Harbor Freight? You can get them at Harbor Freight. That's even because they're even cheaper there. But yes, you can get moisture meters at Lowe's, at Home Depot, and there's no reason why you can't. One of the tips when you are looking at a moisture meter and doing your own quick little survey is obviously look at what your readings are compared to what your instructions say, because each meter is different. But then also what you can do if you have a known dry spot in the same facility, take it to that place, look at what that number is. So if you take it to a dry wall and you're sure that this area is dry and it says 17, and then you take it to this other spot and it says 27, even though it's considered in the correct range based on your instructions, you're going to want to, you know that there might be something going on, because compared to what you see or compared to what you know is dry, it's slightly elevated.
Thank you.
Please.
Is it safe to assume, or is it possible, is an RPR certification required to be a Class A licensed contractor through D4?
No, it's a, well, it depends on what they're doing, but an RRP certified contractor, that's strictly through EPA. Yeah. And so it's not that they have to have also have a contractor's license, but they oftentimes will. But where you'll find people with RRP certifications are going to be typically your painters, and then like window replacement companies and things like that. Because when it comes to the RRP certification, while we teach it as a general, everybody should have it, it really comes down to repair, replace, and painting. That's what it stands for. And so it comes down to the materials that are being impacted, which ends up being mostly your windows and painting.
Ms. Moon, I have a question. So back in the old days, we used to do inspections like a year ago. And you would find down in a crawl space, there would be a floor joist, and it would be noted by the home inspector, there is mold. And everyone would lose their mind. Is there mold that we're concerned about or mold that we're not concerned about?
So it comes down to how people react. So my mom is allergic to penicillin, like she can't take the medication. And so for her to go into a house that has penicillin aspergillus, she's going to react differently than me going in because I don't have a penicillin allergy. And so it's hard to say that yes and no, there's safe molds, or there. I mean, it all has to do with your reaction or the homeowner's reaction. When it comes to crawl spaces, one thing to keep in mind is that it's an unconditioned space. And so that's not abnormal to find mold in those areas. There is a chance that if there's elevated moisture and that might be triggering it. So it comes down more to, let's look and see if there's elevate, like is the building slope properly? Is the water actually draining away, or is it ponding underneath? And that can cause some more issues. But in the end, there's really no safe versus not safe mold. It all has to do with your personal reactions.
The RRP certification, you said that's through EPA. Is there
Yes.
a place to go to find who is RRP certified?
You should.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh.
If they can't hear me.
Okay, sorry. He asked for the RRP certified contractor, where you can go to find a contractor, right? Is that what you're looking for? So on the EPA website, there should be a place where you can go find it, just like the NRSB website to find a radon certified person. There is somewhere on the EPA's website where you can Google, like they'll have an entire list of contractors who are RRP certified.
Thank you.
On asbestos, if we find a floor and it's missing, there's asbestos tile and one or two of them are cracked, does the whole thing have to come up, or can we just deal with those few little issues?
So specifically speaking of floor tile, it actually is going to end up being safer if you just leave it in place, because it has to do with disturbing it. So even though you have one or two tiles that are maybe cracked, it's still not a huge concern. When you say, I'm not sure exactly what your question is. Can you abate that one floor tile?
Do you have to?
No, you don't have to. No, you don't have to. You don't have to remove asbestos at all unless it's going to be impacted. So if you're going to have a flooring contractor come in to remove to put in a new floor, then that material doesn't have to be removed unless they need it out of the way to put something else in its place.
Or any other questions? Anything else, Laura?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. Ms. Moon, thank you very much.
Let me see if I can figure out how to stop this.
Yeah. Okay.
Voila. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, in the room, out of the room, in your house, wherever you are. My name is John Stump. I'm co-owner of Hill Top Contractors with my brother, Matthew Stump. I appreciate the invite to be a presenter this morning to you all here in the room and you all out there in virtual land. Tim, thanks for the invite again. Last time we did this, I think we were still in the throes of COVID. So we were all completely isolated. So it's nice to see some faces in person. We're going to start with the disclaimer. I don't think I need to read this. It was already said at the beginning of the meeting. However, I was asked to include this in my presentation. Oops. There we go. By being proactive, a petroleum storage tank won't be a hazard to you or your clients. If you take away one thing from my presentation today, my biggest recommendation to every person that's involved in a real estate transaction, whether you are representing the seller or you are representing the buyer, is be proactive when you see these tanks, when you see pipes that are associated with the tank, or you even suspect that there is a tank involved in this process, because I overwhelmingly get calls from realtors in the 11th hour when a home inspector says there's a tank in the basement of this house. Somebody needs to check this. There's a tank buried outside of this house. Someone needs to evaluate this. I'm a home inspector. I do not have the credentials to do this. And I usually get these phone calls that have at most about a week's worth of time left in a home inspection. And we are just covered up with work, typically all the time, but especially now in this frenzied housing market. And it's very tough. We try our best to accommodate you folks, to help you all and your clients out, but we cannot promise a tight timeline like that. Most of these tanks, you can see them in the basement of a house. You can see them behind the house. You can see the pipes sticking up outside of the house. We're going to look at some examples in my presentation, but I think most of you folks know what I'm talking about here. So just keep that in mind. All the rest of this, you can call me and I can reiterate it on the phone. But the biggest thing is just be proactive for the sake of your clients and your paycheck. In my opinion, we have three types of storage tanks. We have underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks, and we have unknowns. There's our sites where you don't see direct evidence of a tank being on a property, but you suspect that there might be one there. I do consider that a type because there's an approach to answering the question as to whether or not there is a tank. So one second here. Jim, do you know if I can move this stuff off of my screen? Maybe not. I can just work around it if not. Since stuff go away. Yeah, we'll just, I'll deal with it. So the underground petroleum storage tanks, we will come out and do an initial site assessment, and often consultants will do these residential assessments for free. Myself and several other companies here in Roanoke will come out and we'll check the underground tanks to see if they are leaking or have leaked in the past. It's not typically the case for a commercial property. Do we have many folks in this room that deal with commercial properties? So mainly speaking to the residential side of things. If the tank is leaked or is leaking, I recommend that you or your clients seek funds from the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund administered by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. This fund functions like an insurance policy. It was created by our state water board to protect water. It is administered by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and it functions like an insurance policy. Its sole purpose is to clean up releases from petroleum storage tanks, whether they be above ground, below ground, small tanks at a private residence, big tanks at a truck stop, or even a bulk plant. So the typical site work, if we do find a leaking tank and we report this to Department of Environmental Quality, as of now, of course, things can change with the state. They usually ask us if there's not much contamination of the site to obtain some additional soil samples or further characterize the site to see if the levels of contamination are not as bad, about the same, or worse. If this is not a bad release down in the ground, the state considered it localized. It's not going to impact a receptor or water, and therefore they just have us to remove the remaining contents of the tank, and it stays in the ground. It's not deemed a threat to human health and the environment. If there is a significant amount of contamination around this tank, the state will ask us to remove the tank contents, the tank, the impacted soils that are beside or below the tank, and then we do a full site restoration, a turnkey job. If these buried tanks have not leaked, it is an out-of-pocket expense, or you can close these tanks in place. I get a lot of calls for folks looking to fill tanks with sand or whatever else. I will share this with you all. I do not fill tanks with inert material. I do not close them in place. That is my choice as a contractor. It's perfectly acceptable to do that. But however, I choose not to. The reason why I choose not to is because I have encountered multiple real estate transactions where a mortgage underwriter or an insurance underwriter will not allow a transaction to proceed just because of the presence of the tank. They don't care what I say. They don't care what the lab analysis says. They don't care what state regulators, state code says. If the tank's there, they don't have an interest in it. So I feel like I would be doing someone a disservice if I filled this tank up with an inert material and then they came back to me and said, actually, the tank's got to come out of the ground, because now that removal is extremely costly compared to just spending a little bit more money and removing the tank instead of filling it with an inert material. There are very few exceptions where I understand they have to be filled. However, I just choose not to do that as a contractor. There's plenty of other contractors in Roanoke who will. So that's a viable option. Going back to the fund, like I said, it functions like an insurance policy. There's technically a $500 deductible for residential sites. However, there are a lot of consultants here in the Roanoke area that waive that deductible for folks who work with them. Now, deductibles for the commercial properties are $5,000 and up, but that's a whole different beast. I'm going to show you a few examples of some underground tanks. This is a very nice house, and I'm not sure the name of the neighborhood. It's the mountain beside Mill Mountain near the hospital, and this is literally right on top of the mountain. And we evaluated the tank. It is right in front of the house beside the stoop. And after this tank did have oil in it, I don't recall whether it was in use at the time of removal. However, you can see how deteriorated this tank was, and it had oil in it, and it was leaking into the ground directly adjacent to the basement to this property. This is a site that we just finished some work up on. This is down in Rocky Mount. The homeowner smelled vapors in her basement and asked us to evaluate her tank. And this was her heat source here. She actively used it to store oil for her oil furnace as her only heat source. And you can see how deteriorated this tank was when we removed it. And it had leaked so severely that there was impact to the living space of the basement. This is another house down in the Rocky Mount area. There is a couple of pipes sticking up to the right of the front door there. As you can see, that's where the tank was located, out front of the house. These folks had an interior French drain and a sump pump upgrade done by JES. And shortly after the upgrade, the sump filled up with heating oil. I'm guessing that the interior French, there was already oil down in the ground, but I'm guessing the interior French drain gave it a path to the sump. This was actual seepage. Think about 70-ish feet from the tank into a creek that's on the side of the property. And this is what the sump pump looked like upon our arrival. And this site was completely remediated by the fund. I think pretty much all of these sites were fund eligible. But here you can see, again, this tank was used as heating storage for the property owner. And while I kind of crushed the tank getting it out of the ground, you can see how decayed it was upon removal. This was a commercial site down in Wytheville. This was a real estate transaction. In this photo, the property owner that was our client, the building was actually to my back when I took these photos. This gentleman purchased a lot in between these buildings to expand his footprint of parking lot. However, the lot in between the two buildings had a buried gasoline tank in it that was used by the original Wytheville cab company. If you could believe it, the town of Wytheville actually had a cab company. That's kind of bizarre, but this was a fund eligible site. There was in fact gasoline contamination to the soil around the tank. Moving along, we have above ground storage tanks. They seem to be particularly prevalent from my experience here in the Roanoke area. When we get out into the more rural areas, we seem to experience more of the underground tanks. Exactly why that is, I don't know. I wish somebody could answer that question. I'm guessing that's just contractor's choice. But in any case, that seems to be our experience. We have two types of above ground storage tanks, outdoor and indoor, which are typically in a basement or a crawl space. If the tank has leaked or is leaking, again, you should work with a consultant and procure funding from the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund to address this leaking tank. By no means am I the only one in this town that does it. There's not that many of us, but the other companies that do, I give them top-notch endorsements as well. So I know them, they're friends, they're colleagues, and they all do good work. If a tank is older, it's indoors, it's in use, I strongly consider as part of your negotiations to replace that tank. I get asked the question a lot, how long are these above ground tanks good for? And the below ones too, but some of the tanks that we install have a manufacturer's guarantee of 10 years. I would say at 20 years, you're very comfortable. At 30, you really need to replace that tank, because most of the tanks that we are cleaning up releases from are 30 plus years old. They really are gone by the time they hit the 40, 50, and especially the 60-year mark, whether these are above ground tanks or below ground tanks. A lot of people have the misconception this tank is in a basement, it's out of the weather, it just holds oil, there's no deterioration. I can see it with my own eyes. What you cannot inspect are the conditions from the inside out, and that's where the deterioration is occurring.
And if it's deteriorating, the fund will help you remove it, right?
Not, here's the catch-22 of the fund, only if it has released oil. And that's the frustrating aspect of the fund. So if you're a proactive homeowner, you got to pay for it. If you're not proactive and wait till that tank makes a mess, the fund's got your back. If a tank is out of use but contains oil, I highly recommend at a very minimum, just have that oil removed. If someone cannot afford to have the tank, the empty tank removed, I completely understand that. But if you have an old tank sitting in the basement or crawl space of a house and it has oil in it, it's only a matter of time before it releases. And we clean them up all the time.
How expensive is it to remove the tank out of the house?
Now, are you speaking of an out-of-pocket removal that has not leaked?
Well, I would imagine if you went to the government, it's probably some help with this wall.
So essentially, if the tank has released and it's caused a mess, then the fund's going to cover 100% of that cost of these tanks. If the tank has not been breached, if there is no leak or release, then 100% of that cost is on the property owner. And so you're asking how much would that cost and out of pocket? Approximately, I would say $1,200 to $2,400, somewhere around that mark. It's dependent on site conditions, volume of oil that may have to be disposed of out of those tanks. So that's just a ballpark figure there. You're welcome.
Sometimes I've come into houses and it appears that the tank is too old to just go out the door.
Yeah.
And, you know, people say, oh, that tank's been there, it's not, it hadn't been used in 20 years, but it's too big to remove. What do you do then? Do you dismantle it to get it out?
Yeah, I'm too old to carry a whole tank out of the house at this point in my career. So yes, practically, unless we can literally roll a tank out of a house, they all get cut and cleaned inside of the structures and then taken out piece by piece.
John?
Yeah.
In the future, will you repeat the questions that you're being asked?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So going back to the presentation here, removal of these above ground tanks, in my opinion, is preferred. However, there is no requirement for your transactions or any regulatory bodies, but I highly recommend it. And you're about to see why I highly recommend it. This was a phone call that we received for a simple removal of 2 tanks in the backyard of a house. They were switching from oil to gas. Pretty easy peasy. This is kind of indicative of a typical basement above ground tank removal. You can see a little bit of staining on the top of the tank from where it was probably filled to the top of the fill pipe. That is not considered a release. However, you can see to the right there, you know, the tank's out of the way. There's no mess left in the basement. This was a very unwise flipper who renovated a house in the Hollins area, did a spectacular job with the full renovation. However, for some reason, they left a above ground tank disconnected in a utility room. And the buyer said, no way, I'm not buying this house with this disconnected empty tank in the back room. So we had to remove these tanks through brand new walls, paint, and carpet. It was unnecessary, in my opinion. This is an above ground tank out in Botetourt that just one day sprung a leak. You can see the, as we call it, distressed vegetation, AKA dead grass below the tank, and a couple of barrels where they had tried to catch the oil once they found the leak. And all of that oil came from literally just a little old drip in the bottom of that tank. This was a terrible project, to be quite frank. This was a real estate transaction. The house is located behind the Civic Center. The house was under contract, and by some little miracle, between the point where it went under contract and it was to close, these tanks decided they were done doing their job. And I have no idea how much oil was released, but it was enough to flood a good 2/3 of the entire basement of the house. And as you can see, the homeowners didn't exactly keep things neat and tidy in the basement where the release occurred. So you can kind of see one of the tanks. These photos are all taken from the same view of the room during our cleanup. So that's when we finally got enough stuff away to figure out exactly where the tanks were located. This is after removal of the tanks and a whole bunch of the impacted debris, which all had to be thrown away, disposed of. This is after a couple of initial cleanings of the floor, drying of the floor, and ultimately in situations where these releases are very significant to a porous concrete floor, we cannot remove all of the vapors from the impacted floor, and we ultimately just have to seal them in. Now, we do air monitoring to ensure that we were effective with sealing them in. However, you're not going to go in and jack up this floor just because it smells like petroleum. So this is kind of the last measure if we can't clean out the smell. This was a site down in Pulaski. And yes, all of that red is heating oil in the basement of the house. The homeowner had one above ground storage tank that was prior to our arrival actively in use. There's the tank back in a little room, and literally it completely flooded the basement of this house. And it all came from that one little teeny tiny hole right there in the bottom of the tank. And ultimately, after a lot of cleaning and a lot of painting and a lot of moving personal belongings, the basement was cleaned and the remaining vapors were sealed in, and the homeowner was pleased. These are some examples of some above ground tank installations. I will also say that as a contractor, we do tank installations. However, we do not install tanks in structures. If someone has an above ground tank and they want it replaced, we're happy to do that, but we will not put it back in the basement. I'm too lazy to carry one of these things down some basement stairs. One, but two, most importantly, you know, when you clean up releases and they look like that and they have that much impact to somebody's house that they live in, there's no need to store these tanks in the basement, in my opinion. There are other contractors here in Roanoke that will replace them in the basement if you have a client who's adamant that it has to go back inside, but we do not do that. This is just a few examples of some tanks we've installed. Our final category of tanks are the unknown petroleum storage tanks. Let's say you no heating source utilizes oil. However, there are some pipes sticking up in the yard. Somebody's on gas. We do see instances where folks try to cover up a tank because they know it could be a real pain in their rump. So they'll cut the pipes off, and they may not cut all the pipe off or all the pipes. Sometimes there'll still be product lines protruding through a foundation, and it's evidence that the tank is still out there somewhere. We do have techniques where we can search for these tanks and figure out if they still remain on the property. If there's a fuel dispenser but no visible tanks or piping, that's a little more specific to, say, like a farm. Well, we've done some investigations out at farms where folks have said, oh, that fuel dispenser's been there since my granddaddy was here, but nobody's put any gas in it. Well, they don't know if there's a tank in the ground or not. Or the site has a history of petroleum usage, but no visible tanks or piping. That's a little more on the commercial side. I want to show you an example of a real estate transaction that occurred right around the corner from here. There were a couple of flippers bought this house, and their inspector found, did not realize that this little teeny tiny vent pipe beside the gas meter was a vent pipe to a buried storage tank. They renovated the house. They flipped it to a corporate purchaser who had their own inspector or inspectors to come through the residence prior to purchasing it. And they did recognize this pipe. And they said to the owner, we will not buy this property until that tank is gone. And as you can see, it was a real pain in the rump to get this tank out because we have a gas. I don't know if you can see the yellow misutility markings, but we've got a gas line here. We have a stone wall, which is the property line. The wall belonged to the neighbors. We have the house, and we have an HVAC unit. And it was brutal, to say the least, getting this tank out of the ground and getting fill material back in here. However, the owners just had to pay to have it done because I think they made a very substantial profit on the property. But this is a good warning that that was missed by their inspector, but the next person's inspector found it. And so you just really want to be attentive to whether or not these tanks are there. I'll touch just very briefly on phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site investigations, because in my opinion, this still falls into the unknown tank situation. I will say that Alexandra's company is far more experienced and they turn these things out like nobody's business. And to be frank, they're a better deal than what we are as far as doing these, because they just do a sheer volume. We focus in on more doing turnkey jobs. One of the things that sets us aside as a contractor is we literally own all the equipment unless it's a very specific need for a site. So when we go out and we do a job, it's 100% of our employees and 100% of our equipment on site. I'd say ECS focuses more on the consulting side as opposed to the contracting side of things.
Yeah, we hire you to come out and remove the tank.
Exactly. So, I mean, to be frank, they're probably going to give you a better price if you have a real estate transaction. But a phase 1, you would do a historical search of records, and you would look for documentation of not just tanks, but other hazards that are on record at a site. You would also do a site visit and see if you can visually identify any potential environmental issues on the site. Again, this extends far beyond just tanks, but tanks are a small portion of what's entailed in a phase 1. If in fact there are some recognized environmental conditions that warrant further investigation, then it's most likely recommended that a phase 2, which essentially takes a look at what you can't see on a site. But this is much more of a, much more on the commercial side of things. And this was a one phase 2 that we did down in the Rocky Mount area. It's glaringly obvious it's a gas station. It's glaringly obvious that there's a tank or multiple tanks on the property. And as a matter of fact, there was contamination down in the ground. However, that contamination was from old tanks and an old release. And through science, we determined that the UST system was functioning properly, and the transaction proceeded with no issues. Again, I'll just reiterate where we started. Be proactive and don't let a tank stall your transaction or your paycheck. Anybody got any questions?
Laura, I think you had one.
We have one question from the Zoom crowd. If you have a buried tank and you don't know how old it is, how will you know if it is damaged or should be replaced? Is it possible you won't have signs of a leak in a situation like that?
Yes, it's completely possible that you would not have signs of a leak just visually inspecting a tank. And this question was in regards to a buried tank, Laura?
Yes.
Okay. Oftentimes folks will say to me, I gauge my tank on a very regular basis. I'm not losing oil. If you see a loss of oil by regularly gauging your tank, you have a catastrophic release occurring. Oftentimes with the majority of these tanks, there is a very slow seepage. And so how we determine whether or not these tanks have leaked or are currently leaking, we install 1 or 2 2-inch hand auger soil borings adjacent to the tank. So we're looking at the soil that is beside, or most importantly, below the tank to see if there is petroleum impact to it. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you.
Well, any other takers? Going once, going twice. We done.
Thank you. So I want to thank all the presenters for coming out and giving us time. Great, a bunch of information out there. Thank all you guys for being there. Don't forget, I may have mentioned it before, there is a survey coming. I think I did mention that. Okay, good. Please send the survey, and we really do use it on the education committee to sit down and figure out what it is we can bring you in the future. Don't forget to check the RVAR website. There are a bunch of GRI classes going on right now. For those of you who have not been through GRI, it's a great designation, not to mention it's a great, it's a large amount of information that's going to help you in your career. So please check it out. Get on the site. You can see all the upcoming classes. And that being said, I think that's it. Thank you all very much. And we're done.
Ask one question, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
How can I access the recording of this?
It will be on, I will upload it to our YouTube channel later on today. Or if you email me, I can send you the link.
Okay, so the question was about the recording of this, how to access it. And as Jim said, it will be put out on the RVR's YouTube channel later today. If you got any questions, contact Jim. He'd be glad to help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Good job, Bob.